Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of the Sci-Fi Podcast from Bloomington, Indiana. I'm Nick Sautra. Today on the podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Dominic Murphy, Associate Professor and Director for the Unit of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. Dominic's main areas of interest are in the philosophy of the cognitive and biological sciences, especially issues in psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience. He has further interests in evolutionary theory, the history and philosophy of biology and medicine, moral psychology, epistemology, and bioethics. In his well-known book, Psychiatry in the Scientific Image, which served as the first core philosophy of science text to focus exclusively on problems in psychiatry, Dominic looked at psychiatry from the viewpoint of analytic philosophy of science and considered three key issues: how we should conceive of, classify, and explain mental illness. If someone is said to have a mental illness, what about it is mental? What makes it an illness? How might we explain and classify it? A system of psychiatric classification settles these questions by distinguishing the mental illnesses and showing how they stand in relation to one another. Dominic's book explored the philosophical issues raised by the project of explaining and classifying mental illness. Dominic argued that the current literature on mental illness, exemplified by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, is an impediment to research, that it lacks a coherent concept of the mental and a satisfactory account of disorder, and yields too much authority to common sense thought about the mind. He argued that the explanation of mental illness should meet the standards of good explanatory practice in the cognitive neurosciences, and that the classification of mental disorders should group symptoms into conditions based on the causal structure of the normal mind. Aside from his work in the philosophy of psychiatry, Dominic's main current project is a book on self-representation. This looks at recent work on the self in the cognitive neurosciences and social psychology, and considers the implications of this work for some philosophical ideas about the nature and function of the self and its relation to theories of cognitive architecture. Dominic's also working on delusions, psychopaths, and the role of model building in the inexact sciences. So it was a real great pleasure to talk with Dominic here, especially myself being someone who's genuinely interested in the philosophy of the cognitive and biological sciences as they pertain to psychiatric science. We have a really good chat about how Dominic starts as a philosopher of mind and kind of comes into philosophy of science, how he got interested in working with other scientists, including clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. We get into talking about some key current problems and issues in the philosophy of science, as well as issues in psychiatry. So, I think this is going to be a very fun chat to listen to. A really great interview. I really sincerely enjoyed it. I hope you do too. Okay, without further ado, let's bring in Dominic. As I'd like to do with a lot of the guests, let's start back in the beginning. So, Dominic, where did you grow up?
I was born in Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales. My mum's family are all Welsh coal miners. My dad's from the west of Ireland, from County Cork, but I grew up mostly in Gloucestershire, in the west of England.
Okay, and how was growing up there?
It's very beautiful. It's one of these, sort of bits of England that everybody thinks of when you think of England. It's all rolling hills and ancient cottages and castles, which, of course, when you're a teenager, isn't really what you're looking for.
Sure.
So it was quiet, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose there's a difference between, Dominic and as a teenager, between, maybe going back now and appreciating its beauty for what it is. Okay, sure. Cool. What kinds of things were you interested in growing up?
So I guess I was always a very bookish kid, and I read an awful lot. I read a lot of history, I read a lot of fiction. I was never very interested in science growing up, which is the sort of funny thing. But I was always interested in history, I think that was probably the main. Insofar as I had an intellectual interest when I was a teenager, it was probably history.
Yeah. So what was it? What was it that drew you to history? As a teenager.
I have very little idea. There's just about me always wants to understand,
Sure.
history or the genealogy. Even now, I'm always happiest if I have if I can understand the way things got to be the way they are.
To put some narrative to it. Yeah, I know we can only do so much, but I can understand that. You'd mentioned your sort of unexplainable interest in history as a teenager, but then getting in, you said some interest in fiction, writing, reading.
Reading. I've always actually, and I still do find writing a terrible chore. But I've always read quite a lot of fiction. I read all sorts of stuff when I was a teenager, fairly indiscriminately.
Fantastic. Did you have any
sort of whatever was lying around?
Yeah. Any favorites that stand out that you can recall?
I read a lot. I mean, it's in some ways kind of embarrassing to look back on, but I read a lot of the books that you associate with sort of, Kurt Vonnegut, this also, the kind of books you associate with, or I tend to associate now with adolescence.
Sure.
I read a lot. Yeah. I don't know if there's that many. It's hard to pick a favorite. It's always been hard to pick a favorite for me.
Sure. And you mentioned that as a child, or as a teen as well, you really didn't have a particular interest in science growing up.
That's right.
So how did you, if you can kind of tap back into that, how did you think of science back then?
I think I guess I just thought it was tremendously boring, and that's mostly, I think, because of the way it was taught in high school. My dad was in the Merchant Navy, and then he worked in the oil industry, and he, I suppose, was an engineer. But he never really made an attempt to persuade me to take it up. And I think to a large extent it was just a matter of the kind of teaching I got pushed me in one direction rather than another when I was a teenager.
Sure.
Nobody seemed to make any effort to make science.
Did you have some good history or English professors? I can imagine.
I had some very good teachers in modern languages and in history, and sort of much less so in the sciences, I think.
Okay. Well, that's fair. So, coming up of age, did your parents have any interest in terms of what they were hoping you would do, or did they foster some wide appreciation, or do what you please? What were they? I
think my mother, more than anything else, probably would have liked me to have been a lawyer, and in particular, a barrister, a courtroom.
Sure.
Because in Britain, there's lawyers, there's barristers and solicitors, and they have different jobs.
Sure.
And so the sort of courtroom lawyer, I think that's something they would have liked, probably.
Okay. And what did you think about that?
It never really appealed.
Sure. But you got into, another form of argumentation, that is philosophy.
I did. I got into another form of argumentation that involves regularly standing up in rooms in front of people and trying to persuade them of things.
Yep. Just not in Britain, at least.
Just not in Britain, not with a wig.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, so coming up, where did you do your undergraduate?
I did my undergraduate at Trinity College in Dublin.
Oh, great.
An old sort of, one of the sort of familiar architecture of the old British universities, but right in the middle of Dublin, which is a tremendous town.
Yeah, I happen to...
Great time to be a student.
Yeah, I bet. How did you like Trinity?
I enjoyed it very much. It was a good community in many ways, and the sort of people I was interested in, the faculty were all very approachable. I lived in fairly close to the centre of Dublin. I had a bunch of friends. Yeah, it was good.
Good. Now, at this time, were you studying philosophy? Did you go? What did you go into school for?
No, I started out studying social science. I was interested, I guess, never much in philosophy, because you don't see philosophy in high school in the UK, but I was interested in political philosophy, I think. or probably, in fact, I was interested in knowing more what you think was political theory. So I started out doing social sciences, but social science was taught in the business school, basically. And so I took a whole bunch of courses and stuff that I was completely not interested in. And then I switched in my second year initially to study philosophy and modern history, and I just stuck with philosophy. I got hooked on philosophy.
Huh. Did you have any good professors that you can recall from?
I had a terrific professor in philosophy of mine, an Australian guy called Bill Lyons, who wrote, I don't think he's a super well-known guy. He wrote a book on emotion, he wrote about introspection, and a few other things. And the interesting thing about Bill was that I think a lot of my contemporaries were brought up in philosophy of mind to think there were only 2 or 3 interesting things you could talk about. You could talk about consciousness, maybe. You could talk about content, the sort of mind-body problem. But Bill was very much... I guess he was very much an admirer of Dan Dennett and had a very similar approach, and had written a book about Gilbert Ryle, so had a very sort of Dennettian take. But he was somebody who thought the philosophy of mind should be about everything. So if you took a course with him, you'd talk about memory, you'd talk about introspection, you'd talk about folk psychology, you'd talk about moral psychology. So I got this great sense that there was an enormous field that had all sorts of interesting things to explore in it.
That's fascinating. So at the time when you were studying this, how much of this, if at all, translated, if you're speaking about other topics that are now somewhat being breached by some of the empirical sciences, was this a more direct analytical approach in the traditional philosophy of mind in terms of expanding the breach of what Bill Lyons thought, or how did he?
Bill always mixed up philosophy and psychology. A lot of the psychology wasn't what you'd think of as mainstream cognitive science. Quite a lot of it had other kinds of roots. He was a big admirer of a British psychologist called British psychologist called Magda Arnold, who wrote a big book called Emotion and Personality. Okay. He was very skeptical about psychoanalysis, but he was very interested in sort of cognitive psychology and abnormal psychology more generally, I think.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah. And lots of Dennett. We read a shitload of Dennett.
Well, that was big. That was big.
That was big at the time, yeah.
Cool. All right. So, going to your undergraduate, and you said, so you started in doing history or doing political theory. Were you politically motivated at the time?
Not in the sense that I wanted to learn how to change the world or overthrow the system.
Sure.
I was just sort of interested in
how things worked,
in an analytic sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah. Fast. Okay. Cool. And so at this time, were you now set to the path of going into academia, or what were you thinking at the time?
I think I probably was. I had a couple of teachers who tried to... I mean, this is 25 years ago, and things were much better for a young person than they are now, but I had a couple of teachers who still sort of sat me down and said, are you sure about this? This is very risky, this is a lottery, you've got to be in love. Are you in love with the subject?
Yep.
But I guess I sort of, felt that I was.
Okay. And what did you, I got to say, what did you love about it at the time? And hopefully still now, but what was it that really got you excited?
It's a hard question to answer. So in some ways, it's like answering why you fall in love with a particular person. It's very
sure.
There are things
it's easier to ask how than why, I suppose.
If it's a person, you can say, well, nobody can chop a cucumber the way she does. You got to see her chop this cucumber in this special way, and everybody thinks you're nuts, right? So there were lots of it's hard to come up with an answer that makes sense for other people. I had a bunch of interesting. I had 2 great teachers. I mentioned Bill Lyons. I had a great teacher, a guy called John Dillon, who was an ancient philosopher, and in particular wrote about the Neoplatonists. And one of the things that always attracted me to philosophy was I got this sense it was a discipline that both had a series of unanswered questions and had a particularly interesting history, and you were allowed to think about both. And that was something that sort of always appealed to me. That nobody was going to mind if you were interested in Plato and Aristotle and you were interested in Dan Dennett, and this would not be regarded as eccentric or bizarre.
I haven't heard someone make that point. I think that is a really good point. It kind of allows you to do
so
both.
It's hard. It's hard when you become a professional. You can't. It's very, very difficult to specialize in both, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But I do know other people who think like this. So I was a colleague of Jesse Prinz's for a while, and Jesse was always somebody who might not have written or published a whole bunch of stuff, say, on the 17th century, but would always be living in that literature. And I know quite a lot of philosophers who've got much more of an historical hinterland than you might think. But it's hard to keep a serious scholarly profile in more than one area.
Sure. So, okay, so that, and I suppose, did you have any particular areas in undergrad, if you were doing history, philosophy, that you were attracted to, or that you?
Well, I wrote partly under John Dillon's influence. I actually wrote my senior undergraduate thesis on Plotinus, which is something that everybody seems to find hard to believe now.
Can you explain a little about Plotinus and what's some of those ideas?
So I wrote a senior. So I was interested in ancient philosophy, and I was interested in philosophy of mind. One of the odd things about my undergraduate education was I took almost no straight-up analytic metaphysics or epistemology. So I had these sort of big, odd gaps in my formative years. So I had a lot of history and a lot of philosophy of mind, and some philosophy of language.
Yeah, that's surprisingly, as from talking to a number of folks, you're definitely not alone in terms of coming in with these certain gaps in maybe what we might consider to be the sort of the main selling points that philosophy offers. I think it was before the sort of big analytic metaphysics wave in particular hit, and I think a lot of people of my generation, maybe more so in the UK than in North America, in sort of Western Europe than North America. But I also had a couple of teachers when I did my master's degree at UCL. I had a couple of teachers who thought there was no such subject as metaphysics. Sure. All right. Okay. So, being influenced with philosophy of mind, history of philosophy. You said, was this? Did you immediately go and do a master's at UCL?
I did. Yeah. I jumped over to UCL straight away.
Fantastic. And was this at this point where you had you found your way into philosophy of science yet, or what were you up to?
Not really. I had a conception, I suppose, of the philosophy of mind that thought of it as continuous with psychology, with the behavioral cognitive sciences more generally. But I'd taken a couple of... I'd taken one sort of year-long philosophy of science course as an undergraduate, which did the kind of traditional, start with the positivists, Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, that sort of... So I'd done that, and that was pretty much all the philosophy of science that I had, really.
Okay. So, going into your master's, what was the plan, or what were you interested in?
Well, originally I wasn't sure if I was going to stick with philosophy of mind or do some history, and I ended up writing a master's thesis with Mike Martin on the imagination, actually, and that was kind of good old-fashioned analytic philosophy of mind to a large extent. But around London at the time, there were a bunch of people who were talking to psychologists and to neuroscientists, and I took a long seminar that Mike ran and a fellow called Gabriel Siegel, who was at King's then. And they sort of brought a bunch of... John O'Keefe, the sort of the original Hippocampus, was a cognitive map guy. He came in. Tony Chalice, who's a cognitive architecture guy. A whole bunch of interesting psychologists sort of came through this seminar, and that was probably the single biggest sort of formative influence in giving me a sense that this was something I'd really be interested in doing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because I see here, I mean, your kind of main interests include, philosophy of the cognitive and biological sciences.
Yeah.
And this is right at the time when cognitive science was, or philosophy of cognitive science, I should say, as well as cognitive science was starting to get its, as a sort of a mainstay separate from maybe more traditional analytic philosophy of mind too.
I think so. I think they're almost two different subjects now. Mm-hmm. I think there really is a sense in which the philosophers of mind are interested in a whole bunch of questions about content and supervenience, and the philosophers of cognitive science are interested maybe in, it's a gross oversimplification, but I do think there's a sense now in which there's two different subfields.
Okay. And, and so how did you like your time at UCL?
It was very enjoyable. It was a different sort of take on philosophy in many ways. It was much more English. It was probably a bit more analytic, except for a few people. But it's a big community. I mean, one of the things, for whatever reason, the University of London has chosen to represent itself as a whole bunch of separate establishments. But there is, at least in philosophy, there was then a big group, a big community. All the colleges ran joint seminars. You could go and talk to and study with whomever you wanted, almost. So it was a big community. Lots of interesting people. It was fun.
Very nice. And so then after and I must say, what were some of your ideas? You mentioned you did something on imagination. What was kind of the main claim?
Gosh, no, we're gonna have to. This is a long time ago. The main claim. So the thing I was interested in was, roughly speaking, if you had. Well, think about sort of sense datum theory of perception, right, which I suppose not many people officially have anymore. But if you have one of these, there are certain sorts of theories of perception on which it seems really hard to distinguish the experience you have when you're seeing something from the experience you have when you're imagining it.
Sure.
And so, in some sense, what's the difference between the content in those two cases? And one obvious thing to take is, you could be a direct realist about perception, and you could think that what's happening when you have a perceptual experience is it's just an aspect of the world, right? Whereas in imagination, it's something else. It's a different kind of content. So it's sort of a disjunctivist kind of view.
Okay.
I guess.
Okay. Very nice. Okay. So what was what came next? What was I
went to Rutgers.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you did the master's and then went and studied in the States.
Hopped to the States.
To the States. How was that transition? I'm very curious. As studying in Britain and going to the States.
It was. Initially, I thought it was sort of, I just went to New Jersey. Initially, I thought, it's just, pretty much like home. Everyone speaks English. I know all this. I've seen lots of American TV. I can cope with it. After a while, you realize it's a bit different. Yeah. Initially, it seems quite straightforward, and after a while, you realize, this kind of is a foreign country after all. But philosophically. Yeah. I sort of went to Rutgers because, it had this, not entirely warranted, but not unwarranted at all, reputation as a sort of naturalistic hotbed in the philosophy of mind. And so that's really the main reason why I went there.
Yeah, I forget who's still there. I want to say. Oh, well, who did you study with? Do you recall some of the folks that were faculty that were studying?
Yeah, so I studied, I ended up writing a dissertation under the direction of Steve Stitch.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And he's still there. And, Brian Law was around, Jerry Fodor was around, Colin McGinn was around, and, Barry Lower, Brian McLaughlin, there were Frankie Egan and Bob Matthews. There were a lot of really good philosophers of psychology to talk to.
Cool. And so, was it at this point that you had, were you still rooted in, at Rutgers, more philosophy of mind, or had you, made some sort of a transition to being more focused in the philosophy of science?
So, here's what happened, I guess is the simplest way to answer that question. So what happened is I took a very good, very interesting seminar, again, with Steve Stitch and with a couple of guys from the clinical psychology school at Rutgers. And this was the time when philosophers of mind were first getting into things like autism, and the significance of autism for the theory of mind debate had just sort of blown up, and people were starting to... and we read Ian Hacking's book, Rewriting the Soul, which is about multi-personality. And we read a bunch of stuff on outcome studies in psychotherapy and sort of the science of psychotherapy, I guess. And that's what got me interested in psychiatry and the other sort of clinical bits of the sciences of the mind. It was a few years, really, before I started thinking of myself as a philosopher of science rather than just a philosopher of mind. And I was actually working at Caltech, and somebody came through, and I had a conversation with somebody, and I said, well, I don't really know if I'm a philosopher of science. And Chris Hitchcock actually said, no, psychiatry's a science. You're a philosopher of science.
Okay,
you can.
Yeah.
You're one of the. And I figure if Chris says it, if he gets,
he can vouch for you in terms
science. Yes, Chris. If Chris is prepared to, slap the armband on me, then I guess I'm a philosopher of science. But I always, when I was doing the dissertation, if you'd asked me, I certainly would have said first and foremost I was a naturalistic philosopher of mind. And it wasn't really a time when there was anything called philosophy of psychiatry. Insofar as there was a field in philosophy of psychiatry, you could put the whole discipline in a taxi cab, right? I mean, there was a tiny number of people who were working on it.
So what kinds of questions, I mean, did you find interesting at the time?
I guess there were a couple. So I was interested in questions of, and I suppose these are philosophy of science questions of sort of classification. Yep. Is mental illness a natural kind? How do you go about sorting, people into diagnoses? Is there a sort of general picture of the mind you can use to come up with a kind of causal as opposed to merely sort of phenomenal set of classifications? And then I was just interested in specific issues about, what the hell's going on in, delusion and
yep.
Addiction. There's just, there's no area of psychiatry really that's not philosophically interesting, I think.
And there's a tremendous amount of overlap with general questions. I was just saying there's a tremendous amount of overlap with questions in philosophy of mind as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, cool.
That's how I got into it.
Very nice. And so you said you were working at Caltech. So how did that come about?
Went on the job market, and the job market wasn't great. This is 1999. It wasn't great, but it wasn't like it is now.
Yeah.
And so I got offered a couple. I got offered the PNP postdoc at St. Louis, Washington University.
Oh, yeah.
And I got offered a tenure track gig at Caltech, and Caltech let me sort of postpone for a year to go and spend a year in St. Louis first.
Oh, very nice. How was your time with I would imagine, was Carl Craver there, or some of...
Carl wasn't there. Carl wasn't there yet. I think Carl and I went out in the market at pretty much the same time, and I think his first job was somewhere else. I think we probably were up for a lot of the same jobs.
Sure.
So Jesse Prinz was there, Andy Clark was there, Bill Bechtel was there, and there were a bunch of interesting people in the cognitive sciences too. But those guys were the sort of mainstay, I think, of the sort of philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology wing there.
Very nice. And did you find that, like, how did you spend your time there? Was it developing, finishing up work that you'd done at Rutgers? Was there new things happening? What was going on?
There was, I sort of mostly, I got the feeling that a lot of people get after you finish a dissertation, which is that I never want to look at this goddamn thing again.
Yeah.
And I sort of put it.
Is that how we should expect to feel for those of us working on our dissertations? That's yeah.
What happens is you get your PhD and you have, I think, sort of two experiences. The first one is you spend between 2 days and 2 weeks going around introducing yourself as Dr. So-and-so everywhere you go. And then the other thing is that you just cannot bear to look at your dissertation. So I did some other stuff. Yeah. If I'd been really sensible, I would have, immediately turned around and picked up the thesis and cranked a bunch of papers out of it. But I didn't. I just thought, I'm going to go away and I'm going to learn. I'm going to learn something else. And because of the way the PNP program in St. Louis works at WashU, there's a lot of commerce with the neuroscientists there in a way there hadn't been so much at Rutgers. And also, Rutgers doesn't have a medical school, so there actually were psychiatrists to talk to in St. Louis. So I did a bunch of new things, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with Jesse and with Andy Clark and trying to. There were a bunch of gaps in my education. Postdoc's an odd thing in philosophy, right? Because if it's in the sciences, you go into a lab and you learn a set of new skills that you didn't have before.
Sure.
And in philosophy, it's not entirely clear what postdocs are for.
What are you supposed to do? Yeah.
What you're supposed to do. So I thought, well, there are all these people who are much more invested in neuroscience than I am. So, I spent a long time talking to Bill about the stuff that he'd done on decompositional localization, and I spent a lot of time talking to Jesse and to Andy about sort of more sort of neurologically informed philosophy of psychology. And then after a year in St. Louis, I went to California.
So, okay. So, and I know, from doing a bit of studying in the philosophy of psychiatry, when you look at any edited volume collection of works, I mean, your name comes up as certainly if not perhaps one of the leading philosophers in of psychiatry. I know those other folks, Andy, Jesse, they might have written on some things, but they weren't particularly into the philosophy of psychiatry. So who did you find to work with or hang out with that was particularly in your area?
So I published a couple of papers with a psychologist at Rutgers called Rob Woolfolk, who I was in touch with. I mean, still am in touch with occasionally, but who I was sort of professionally in touch with for a while. In the philosophy of psychiatry, there was a small group of people. There were a few things that had been published. Jennifer Radden had written about it. There's a book by Laurie Resnick. Ian Hacking, I think, was the person who was probably doing at the time a bunch of stuff. And I suppose I spent a lot of time talking to sort of regular philosophers of psychology, philosophers of neuroscience, about things like explanation and sort of general issues in the field, maybe with a view to trying to apply them to problems in psychiatry.
Very nice, very nice. And
but after what?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
Oh well, I was going to ask about, you had mentioned, even starting back at Rutgers, you spoke took classes with clinical psychologists at Wash U. There was actually medical school with working psychiatrists. Yeah. They are not philosophers of science. Maybe they haven't been. Some of them might be more philosophically motivated than others. I was curious if how do those interactions go in terms of what you ask them, what you guys discuss. Are you discussing the scientific literature? Are you discussing the philosophical literature? What are those interactions like?
Well, there's always been a conceptual literature in psychiatry, because I think it's always, or at least since lots of people would date sort of modern kind of biomedical psychiatry probably to the 70s. That's the big takeoff in the USA, in particular in the 1970s. But I think the field's always felt that it was a little bit undercooked somehow in terms of conceptual foundations. That there's a big literature within psychiatry on, sort of really what the hell are we doing? And so I've met a bunch of psychiatrists who've been happy to, who've been interested in talking to philosophers, interested in talking about conceptual issues. There's a conference which has now gone through 4 or 5 iterations that shows up in Copenhagen every few years, run by Ken Kendler, who's at the Virginia Commonwealth, and Joe Parnas in Copenhagen. And they've always assembled philosophers of science, philosophers of mind, and psychiatrists. And those, I've been to a couple of those. I've spoken at 2 of those, and they've been terrific. I've done, grand rounds in medical schools, which is a bit daunting if you're a philosopher. All these people show up and you think, God, you could be out, like saving lives, and you come to listen to me talk about reductionism.
Wait, so by doing the grand rounds, what does that entail? Does that mean
it's basically a sort of, when I've done it, it's sort of a research. In some ways, it's like just doing a sort of regular research seminar. I think it's mostly I think if you're a medic, a lot of it has to do with, here's a case study or here's some research. And if you're a philosopher and you do it, it's in some ways like giving a regular philosophy talk, except the audience is overwhelmingly medics and medical students. But look, I'm sure there are plenty of psychiatrists who are completely not interested in philosophy, but there's always been a group who are. Yep. There's an active history and philosophy of psychiatry group in Sydney, for example,
great.
under the auspices of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry. They have a conference every year. They put up either a historical or a philosophical session at the conference every year. It always gets a decent crowd. So I think there's a lot of psychiatrists who either just have an interest in the philosophical and historical stuff because they're interested in it, or because they feel that the field really is in need of some foundations, is in need of sort of interrogating itself in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So, as you're working on some of this, you got your first job at Caltech. How long did you do research there?
I spent, in the end, 8 years, and I didn't get tenure at Caltech. And I put the tenure clock off for a year when my son was born. Mm-hmm. So in the end, it was about 8 years.
Okay. And how did you? How was it? Living, working in the States. As somewhat, you've been there for a while, but still as a kind of a foreigner, I suppose.
So I wasn't wild about Southern California, I have to say. Sure. And neither was my better half, who's from New England. She's from Massachusetts, and she didn't like it very much either.
It's from the East Coast to the West Coast. It's a jump in lots of ways. I mean, Caltech's a terrific institution. It's very small. Everybody's as clever as hell. I have tremendous colleagues and very good friends. The students are all brilliant, very bright.
Yeah, they're a very very bright, crowd. So it was in many ways a lovely job, although it's not the best. It's not my favorite part of the world, but lots of people love Los Angeles, so I shouldn't not.
That's fair. It's an okay place. I think there are some things that are nice about it. There's some things that are pretty terrible about it, but. Okay. All right. Well, then, I mean, from what I've come to know you for the past, in seeing your work for the past couple of years, you've been at Sydney. So was this, did you make the transition to Sydney from Caltech, or how did that? Yeah. How did it come about to move to Australia to start teaching there?
Well, I was in, Egypt actually, and, because my wife is an Egyptologist by training, and so we were in Egypt one summer. How
was that, by the way?
It was fun. It was fun. But having to arrange, I had to go to Sydney for a job talk from the middle of Egypt, and if you ever get the chance to skip arranging a last-minute flight from Luxor to Sydney, I advise you to go ahead and skip it. But I went out to Sydney, and I loved the place straight away. And the HPS group were very interesting. And I kind of liked the idea, I think, of being in an HPS department.
They have their own HPS. Did they have their own HPS department at the time?
They do. They did. Well, it's a group. It was called a unit. It was always this small part in the science faculty where we still are. It's a bit of an oddity in my career that I've never been in a philosophy department exactly, because I was sort of the PNP postdoc, so I was officially in straddling disciplines, and then at Caltech you have a humanities group rather than a philosophy department, and now I'm in the history and philosophy of science. Well, we were a unit last year, then they told us we were a department, and now we're going to be a school.
Oh, wow. That's pretty big
HPS came about at Sydney in a sort of odd way, connected with, there was a civil war in the philosophy department at Sydney in the 70s, and they split it in two.
Oh, geez.
And a couple of people broke off to form an HPS department, and it's never been entirely it's always had this sort of odd, anomalous situation in the university, so they're gonna rationalize us now and give us a nice place on the organization chart.
Great. So, it sounds like you said you liked it straight away. What is it about Sydney, in the school that you and your family liked?
So, as far as my colleagues go, they're just a terrific bunch of colleagues, and a terrific bunch of colleagues in the philosophy department. There are a couple of people. So, Paul Griffiths had just arrived in philosophy, and I've known Paul on and off for a while. And he's in the philosophy department, and I knew a couple of others. Mark Collivan, who's in philosophy here, visited Caltech while I was there. And Sydney, for whatever reason, just sort of suits me. Paul Griffiths likes to say that Australia has everything you miss about Britain when you live in America, but also everything that you miss about America when you move back to Britain. Yeah, Sydney's, it's a spectacular city. I mean, it's a harbour and beaches, and it's a big enough city to have all the things that you want in. It's not the capital of Australia, but it's got a big enough city to have all the things that you want in a capital in most ways.
Yeah.
Lots of people come through. I went out just last night to hear a steel guitar player from Toledo, Ohio, who was playing down the street in my neighborhood. So, it's got everything you need, I think. It's just, of course, a hell of a long way from everywhere.
It's a long way, but it's a place that I think most people would love. I mean, Sydney is a place that, I've always wanted to visit. I hope to visit at some point soon. Well, that's great. And, as far as for folks, let's say, listening that might be interested in studying at Sydney or in Australia, in universities, how are they distinct from, let's say, the state schools from then maybe the schools in the UK?
So you're talking about people who might be interested in the graduate and the PhD?
Yeah, mainly, I'd say, like graduate, PhD.
So the way PhD programs work is they're sort of like the British one in that you're expected to show up with, an idea for a thesis and sit down and start writing, and you'll be out in 3 or 4 years. Which means, of course, we're all concerned that our students look a bit unprepared in comparison with, say, North American students. So we try and encourage people to take some, there's seminars and there's coursework, but it's a bit more impromptu. Funding's a little bit of an issue. There are Australian government scholarships, and Sydney itself has scholarships for overseas students. We in the department can't afford to pay for more than a couple of people a year, but there are other sources of funding. And it's an expensive town, although most of our postgraduate students seem to manage. But I think not just Sydney, but around New South Wales, there's us and there's Macquarie and there's the ANU, which is a few hours away in Canberra. And particularly, I think, in philosophy of biology and the philosophy of the cognitive sciences now, Australia is as interesting as anywhere in the world, I would think. In Sydney now, Peter Godfrey-Smith is here now, and Paul Griffiths is here, and Mark Collivan's here, and the ANU's down the street. Well, it's like 3 or 4 hours away, but it's very close in Australian terms, and we see those guys a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, great. All right. Well, there's so it sounds like there's some distinctions from it, and some challenges, but also still a pretty good place in terms of if you wanting to study there, or you have an idea for a thesis, it's where you would want to go.
I think so. It's difficult to show up if you don't have any clear idea what you're going to do.
Sure.
Because you don't really have the opportunity to take a couple of years shopping around the way people might do, say, at some American universities.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're a foreign student, because there's a real clock ticking when it comes to
you got to finish, and you got to get that
for a set number of years, and you have to finish. If you've got, particularly maybe if you've already done a master's degree, if you have a sense of what you want to do, I think it's a fine place to come. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't you? I'm curious about getting to some of the projects you're currently working on that you're most excited about. But is there any maybe one or two projects that you've completed, perhaps your book, or anything that you'd like to share?
So the book, the book's like 10 years or so old now.
Sure.
Was written, I say this in the book, but it's really true. I said that, back when I was a graduate student, there just wasn't a lot of philosophy of psychiatry, and I wanted to find a book that did, here's the philosophy of, sort of intersection of philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, psychiatry. If you're a philosopher, this is the kind of book that you should read. So I ended up writing it myself. So I wrote the book that I wanted to read when I was doing my PhD.
Wow.
And
yeah.
And it was great fun, but it's not. I mean, in some ways, I think I tried to make it both a kind of introductory book and a kind of, and here's what you should think, and here are some answers. And I don't know if it entirely worked, but
so it's kind of tricky. Sure.
But since it is tricky, but since since it's the only book that there is, or one of the philosophy of psychiatry, it didn't seem to harm. And it's interesting the way the field has picked up in the last 10, 15 years. I've run into young philosophers now who think of themselves as philosophers of psychiatry, and it's kind of remarkable how that's happened. It's very interesting and very gratifying. But as you say, there's a lot of anthologies with chapters in them by me, and after the book came out, I did take a sort of, in some ways, a conscious decision that it would be good if there was more of a field, and so you kind of have to get the word out, and so I spent a few years doing sort of theory maintenance and trying to push philosophy of psychiatry on, as unwilling philosophical public. Sure. But there are a lot of people now. I think more and more people now who are interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still those small conferences, and some you could probably fit into a taxi cab. But I mean, there's probably like a larger plane now full of people that at least like could, and even folks who are interested in the history and philosophy of medicine or history and philosophy of the cognitive biological sciences with connections to issues in psychology and psychiatry. I
think that's right. I get the sense there's probably more philosophy of medicine than there was 10 or 15 years ago. That, last couple of years, Anya Platinsky's big book on cancer, Miriam Solomon's book, Making Medical Knowledge, I think that we're seeing just generally an uptick in, across the whole of medicine, I think, in philosophy.
Yeah, our Indiana department became the History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine department.
That's interesting.
we just added medicine on there for a number of reasons. Mostly, there's a few historians of medicine on the faculty, and so but to make it just to broaden the scope a bit. Okay, so and I suppose like some of the things you say in the book, how do you it's always interesting to reflect on one's work that's a little bit old. How do you view the book now?
Oh gosh, I suppose you sort of look back and you think, I wish I hadn't quite said that, or that really needed, or that could have done with a bit more, or so it's hard to know. It's difficult to look back because certainly you also don't want to think. Even worse would be to think, "Damn, I could never do anything this good now."
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So I think the book mostly asked the right questions. I'm still, obviously I'm not entirely happy with the answers,
And for those listeners who haven't read, so what are those questions? What are the big?
So the question there's a sort of bunch of general conceptual questions. Sort of what is what is mental disorder? What are we talking about when we call somebody mentally ill? Is there a concept that can be analysed? What sort of commitments do you make? And the first third of the book is about that. And then the middle third is really about explanation. And I suppose it was I was groping towards a kind of mechanistic picture of explanation, which I don't think I really got hold of. But the issues about how you're going to explain this, all these sort of different levels of explanation and how they might interact. And then the last third of the book is really about classification. Because the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, just sort of classifies according to symptoms, and I always thought that mature sciences tend to classify etiologically on the whole. And in particular, medicine does. I mean, the example I used in the book is you don't take everybody who coughs and say that they're all suffering from cough syndrome. Right. The fact that something is, but if people are grouped together in terms of symptoms doesn't tell you very much about etiology, and the classification really, I think you want to go with etiology. So that was the last. So those questions, I think, are sort of conceptual stuff and explanation and classification. I think a lot of action in philosophy of psychiatry in the last 10 or 15 years has been around those questions. As well as specific issues about explaining particular pathologies.
Sure. All right. So perhaps you can tell us, what's what's in your purview right now? What kinds of questions and or projects are you working on?
So, in the philosophy of psychiatry, I'm interested in something which itself got overhauled in the last edition of the DSM, which is the question of sort of cultural variation. So you see an enormous difference. Famously, in many parts of the world, depression seems to show up as physical aches and pains rather than, we have this image certainly in Europe and North America, I think, of depression, in which the hallmark of depression is what Burton in the 17th century called melancholizing. You have these habits of thought, this sort of self-accusation and
sure.
anatomization of yourself and all the millions of ways in which you're a terrible failure as a human being. And in many parts of the world, it seems like psychiatry doesn't work like that. You get these sort of epidemics in psychiatry in which conditions just sort of seem to flare up because of some sort of social context, and it's not quite clear why or where they come from. There's lots of interesting questions about variation across time and place in psychiatric illness. And I think that's very interesting, and I also think it taps into a feeling that I think a lot of people in philosophy of psychology have that was probably made most dramatic by Joe Henrich and his colleagues' famous paper on weird people in BBS a few years ago, that we've built a lot of psychologizing around Western subjects, and in particular Western undergraduates. And that maybe the cognitive sciences need to look a bit more broadly at sort of human cognitive and cultural diversity. And psychiatry, because there's a long tradition of psychiatric anthropologists going around the world and looking at, Native American or Australian Aboriginal sort of disorders or concepts of disorder. I think it's kind of in that ways, I think psychiatry is an interesting test bed for some of these more general issues about how you put, say, cultural explanation and social explanation and computational explanations and neurological explanations, and try and, in some sense, cram them into the same structure. Which I think is something hacking was probably doing, back in the 90s. But I think I think there's not much. There's a lot of interesting stuff about social and cultural forces in hacking's work. There's not a whole lot of psychology. There's a lot of interesting psychology about the way representations move through cultures, which doesn't take into account how things might be different if the psychology was abnormal. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
So yes, so is your project to answer a question of how do you put all these things together?
I think that's what I'd like to do if I could. It's and some people, religion is people who've written about religion who there's a sociology and there's a psychology and there's a whole interesting set of questions. But how you might be able to put a bunch of these different topics together in one theoretical structure, all these different sorts of approaches and fields. So that would be interesting. And I've written a couple of papers recently on sort of limited materialism and where we are now. And I've had a bunch of sort of half-written papers on introspection and self-representation lying around for a long time that keep getting bumped in favor of other projects, but I hope to get back to them soon.
So I see you have self-representation, the structure and function. So by self-representation, what do you mean, and what are you curious about?
So there's a line in Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments where Smith says, if you lived by yourself, if you lived without society, you wouldn't need to be interested in how your own mind works. You only need to be interested in how your own mind works when you have to live with other people. And you have to sort of calibrate your emotional responses to the norms around you, and you have to, in some sense, I think, demonstrate that you fit in. You're making commitments that other people can hold you to. So one of the things that's been of interest to me for a while is there's this big literature in social psychology in particular, and increasingly in cognitive neuroscience, suggesting that we are, as Wilson and Nisbet put it, strangers to ourselves, right? That a lot of the information, a lot of what we think we know about what makes us tick, a lot of the information that roughly introspection or self-reflection seems to deliver, just doesn't look very reliable at all. And a lot of social psychologists, I think, will write on this subject, and they'll say, so it turns out introspection's a very bad way of getting at the truth about yourself. Isn't that interesting? But I was interested in the question, well, if introspection's such a bad way of getting at the truth about ourselves, how come we do it so much?
Yeah.
And it may just be that we're all, self-reflection, the kind of self-image you've got, has a different kind of function, and it might be the one that Adam Smith picked up on, that mostly it's for outward projection. That the image, the sort of conception of yourself that you have is really to help you navigate the social world. And John Doris has written some stuff about this recently when it comes to agency and responsibility. But that's something I'm interested in.
Oh, it's
in
very
looking at.
fascinating.
As I say, I've been thinking about this for a long time without ever really, properly sitting down and doing it. But I got a grant that the Australian government, God bless them, gave me some money to think about this a couple of years ago, which coincided with my becoming chair of the department.
Really?
So it wasn't quite as productive a time as it might have been.
Yeah.
But I've got a bunch of stuff that I hope to crank. That's the kind of thing you do if you're really hoping to churn out the papers in the next few years.
I understand. Yeah, sure. Well, I'm fascinated by this subject. I really love. I really enjoy it, and where you're going with it. I'm curious to see if are there any journals, or I suppose we can maybe expect a paper or two coming out in the near future, or.
I hope so. It depends what the referees say.
Of course.
But
yeah,
I hope so. And I hope to have a bunch of this stuff out in the next couple of years.
Cool. Very nice. Very nice. All right. So this is the time where we're getting a little bit toward the end, but I'm curious about some of your thoughts. Generally about philosophy of science. And the question I'm curious about is, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges facing philosophy of science, and if you'd like, philosophy of psychiatry today?
I think something which a lot of people have worried about in the last, since I became a philosopher, which is the sense that philosophy of science is becoming in some ways hyper-specialized. And the sense there's a sort of general philosophy of science is perhaps starting to ebb away from us a little bit. And that might be inevitable. The more specialization you do, the more it seems like the problems in your particular field, whatever it is, philosophy of physics, molecular biology, whatever you're interested in, and maybe more and more specializations just inevitable. But I think it would be nice, and I think we've lost, maybe, a couple of generations ago there was a sense everybody had that the old deductive nomological model of explanation kind of, sort of held, applied widely across all the sciences and sort of held the field together, and we had a kind of sense of how scientific change and scientific explanation worked across the sciences. And that picture probably was unsustainable, and it's probably good that it's been lost. But I think there is a worry that philosophy of science is kind of is sort of fragmenting a little bit, and it may sort of just be inevitable. But it would be nice to think that there was still there was still a wide unifying. I also think, and again, I'm not the only person to think this either, that the specialization breeds a kind of danger, particularly for younger philosophers, where in some ways it's not always clear what the philosophy is. Sometimes you'll go and hear someone talk, and you'll think, this person clearly knows the science. But if I wanted to hear about the science, I could just go and talk to a random person, right? I want to know what the philosophy really is. And I worry in some cases that people are becoming so embedded in the details of their particular bit of science that some of the philosophical lessons aren't being brought across clearly. And again, it's not an original thought, but I think probably one of the really interesting things that could be done is more work on, I think sort of science and policy, or sort of wider social and political issues that science is embedded in. That you think of a book like Philip Kitcher's Science and Democracy, and lots of people have done this. Feminist philosophers, of course, have been doing this for a long time, but a general sense that there are questions to be asked about the way science relates to the rest of the culture, and particularly to sort of politics or democratic policy making. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that could be done.
Okay. Is that something you yourself would be interested in, or just kind of more of it in terms of supporting? I'm
interested in questions of sort of what happens when sort of ordinary inherited ways of making sense of ourselves get threatened by developments in the sciences. So something that happened in North American psychiatry a couple of years ago is the rise of this RDoC program, what the NIH called the Research Domain of Criteria, right? Which is designed to distribute research money chiefly on the basis of a kind of rethinking of psychiatric categories from first principles, and in particular from brain circuits. The idea basically is mental illness is disorders of brain circuits, and we're going to sort of start from the ground up and build a picture of psychiatric classification and of sort of human, in some ways human behavior more generally, on neuroscience that relies on validated psychological constructs. And sort of scientifically and epistemically, that sounds great, but the concern is, you'll end up with a picture of human beings that's been built by the experts based on the latest science, which will make us unrecognizable, to sort of the average person who's, you go and see the psychiatrist and they tell you, well, what's wrong with you is this, 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 and this, and they give you a whole bunch of stuff, and you know no idea what's going on. And this is something that always interested me in connection to limited materialism, that suppose, the Churchians were right and our vocabulary for explaining the human beings shifted tremendously to something much more neurologically embedded.
Sure.
Well, sort of what would happen, I mean, are we to imagine that, the bar fights of the future will break out when some guy turns to another guy and says, you better watch it, pal, my amygdala's really starting to buzz. Or do we come up with a situation in which a huge majority of people, even educated people, are just left with no resources really to explain themselves, that the way in which we understand ourselves and the way in which science understands us start to diverge. In the sense in which this difference between the scientific image and the manifest image doesn't make much difference if you're talking about, Eddington's most of the time. I remember Bill Bechtel years ago telling me, well, when you learn the truth about fermentation, it doesn't, interfere with your ability to enjoy a beer. But who knows what will happen when we learn the truth about, memory or romantic love or, belief and desire or pain or something like that, whether it will start to undermine the legitimacy of some of the just regular old human projects that we have for living together that seem to have a basis in human psychology. So that's something I am interested in, and that is something I hope to think about a bit more deeply.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned the RDoC, and I've become very familiar myself with the RDoC, and I think it's been brought to attention that there might be issues with cultural variation there. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of kind of a ground-up approach? And I've also heard, but before you say anything, that the UK has a similar RDoCian kind of thing going forward.
There is. I think Europe, well, of course, anything to do with Europe now and especially the UK, it's not clear how it will show up.
Yeah, maybe it's European. I shouldn't say UK, but yeah.
Yeah, but there is a European program which is kind of similar. But about which I know much less. Luc Fauché up in Montreal is I think the philosopher who's looked most closely at the European thing. The Europeans, I think, have taken the sort of ethical and political implications a bit more seriously. RDoC, I mean, one of the concerns people have with RDoC is that although officially, it's multi-level and it's supposed to involve all sorts of constructs relating to human behavior and make room for culture, that it's just going to be, hopelessly reductive because the official line is that it's all to do with brain surgery. I think that it's probably not a new challenge. I think it's a challenge just for the sciences of the mind generally to build a picture. What's particularly of interest, I think, to a lot. So I know a lot of North American psychiatrists, of course, is that you have a tremendous amount of mental health problems that are specific to immigrant groups or to particular races and ethnicities in the North American context. I know there's an organization that Hispanic psychiatrists, for example. There are people interested in, well, what's the connection between, say, panic disorder and ataque de nervios, which is a kind of folk diagnosis throughout much of Latin America, which seems to be sort of like panic disorder, but sort of not like panic disorder, and how you're going to sort them out. So there's a group at Columbia interested in that. There's a bunch of interesting questions about how we're going to understand what it is that to explain to you out of a sort of traditional Euro-American models of understanding.
Sorry, can you say, we cut out a little bit. Could you say that one more time?
So I don't know what the last thing you heard me say was, but I think it's probably not a new problem in psychiatry. I think psychiatry has always had this problem that you have a kind of picture, an idealized picture of the sort of regulation patient, going to be, broadly speaking, a North American of European descent. South America, in which other people for example, people who live in North America but aren't part of mainstream culture. Lots of big countries around the world have this. Australia has this with Aboriginal mental health. So trying to find, I don't think it's a new problem with the RDoC, but I do think that there are people who worry that the RDoC will fail to give this the effect it deserves, this problem.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you, Dominic, for filling us in on a little bit about the RDoC as well, and then sharing with us some of your general concerns or challenges you find in philosophy of science, as well as your story. It was tremendous to hear, and I think this is the first sort of more philosopher of mind sort of converting over to philosopher of science we've had. So that's kind of welcome here, and it's great to have it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to give you opportunity. Is there anything you wanted to mention or share or I suppose plug? I don't know. We kind of talked already about Sydney's graduate program, but I don't know. Is there anything you want to share about?
Oh gosh, I would have assembled some marketing material if I'd known.
I can leave something in the show notes or something later. If you think about it, you can email me or something, and I could, I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if there's a good conference coming up, or I don't know. You can always let me know, and I can.
Well, there is every July the Australasian Association of Philosophy, to which everybody's welcome, and lots of people come from all over the world, and that's always pretty good, I think. And obviously it's a long way, but there are often a lot of good conferences around small plug for the system, which is essentially just a sort of committee to Sydney for a fairly extended visit, particularly if you're a young philosopher, maybe with your first sabbatical.
Sure.
If you really need to kind of have a job somewhere already, because we don't have much money. But if people are interested in coming to Sydney for half a semester or something, couple of months, they should get in touch with me, and we do have some small amounts of money that we can use to defray accommodation and other costs around town.
Very nice. Okay. Well, again, Dominic, it was a great pleasure speaking with you and getting to meet you. And I wish you the best on the end of the semester. Enjoy your Thursday. And I'll talk.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, hopefully talk to you soon.
Well, actually, I'm going off now to a 3-hour meeting on your undergraduate curriculum. So my Thursday is not looking good. But thanks anyway.
Good luck with. Are you not still the chair? Are you?
I'm not. No, I managed to time it brilliantly there because I stopped.
Yeah, I think you might have cut out a little.
And I stepped down from being chair, and I became the whole entire undergraduate curriculum. So I'm the UGSC now.
Okay, but that means planning out the curriculum and all that. So
that means, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, have the best time you can at this meeting. And
all right. Thanks very much.
We'll talk to you soon, Dominic. Bye-bye.
Good talking to you. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. Anytime. Bye.